Yeah, finally we are going to cover a new topic, decision trees. So decision tree algorithms can be considered as iterative top-down construction methods for classifiers and also regression models. So in order to keep the videos kind of manageable and not to make them too long, I split the lecture into 7 parts where we will first get a very brief overview of what decision trees are, how they kind of look like conceptually, and introduce some of the core terminology. And then we will talk a little bit about recursive algorithms in the context of decision trees. So I will introduce briefly what a recursive algorithm is, because that helps us then understand the runtime complexity, the big O, of decision trees. Then we will talk about different types of decision trees. So right now in scikit-learn, what they implement is the so-called CART decision tree algorithm, which stands for Classification and Regression Trees, and that was developed by Leo Breiman. However, there are also other types of algorithms, for example, ID3 and C4.5, and we will briefly go over the advantages and disadvantages of these different methods. And I will likely have you implement some of those as homework exercise, maybe the ID3 one, where I provide you an implementation that I did and then remove some of the code, and you have to kind of add back some code parts of the code, so kind of to understand how the ID3 decision tree works. But in this lecture we will also talk about the different splitting criteria that can be used for decision trees. Like I said, scikit-learn uses CART, which is usually based on Guinea impurity. However, it also allows us to mix and match the different splitting criteria. So with splitting criteria, I mean the function or measure that is used to make a decision to find which is a good feature to split when we split a decision tree. But this is maybe getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, because we haven't talked about decision trees yet. So there will be different splitting criteria we talk about, for example, the Guinea impurity and entropy. And we will also talk about why we use Guinea and entropy instead of the misclassification error when we grow a tree and evaluate how well it does when creating a split. And after we covered all these details, we will discuss some of the improvements that we can make to make decision trees more efficient in terms of computational runtime, but also how we can improve the classification accuracy. And of course, how we can deal with overfitting. And lastly, we will take a look at a code example where we work with decision trees in scikit-learn. So let's maybe start with a very simple concept of a decision tree. So this is not really a machine learning problem here. It's more like a problem that we may face in our everyday life. So the question is basically what we should do at a given moment. So for example, we may ask ourselves whether we have work to do. So if we have work to do, we may have to stay inside and do the work. And if we don't have work to do, there's maybe a chance that we can go outside, and that may also depend on the outlook, on the weather. So if it's sunny, we may decide to go to the beach, if it's not too cold also, of course. If it's overcast, maybe we go for a run instead of going to the beach and going into the water and swimming. We may just opt for going for a run. So the other option would be rainy or even snowy. So if it's rainy outside, we may ask our friends what they are up to. So if our friends are busy, then we still maybe opt for staying inside and then maybe reading a book or something like that. If our friends are not busy, we can, for example, ask them if they want to go to the movie theater. And this is maybe also not a good example right now due to the pandemic situation. So maybe instead of going to the movie theater, we can ask them, to play video games online, or just chat with them online or something like that. So that would be the basic outline of a decision tree where we have different types of decisions. So let me go over the core terminology first. So we have a root node, that is the first question or decision that we have. That's the decision tree root node. And then we have these leaf nodes. These leaf nodes are the ones at the bottom, basically. These are our final outputs. And then there are the internal nodes. So the internal nodes are the decisions that are not the root node. And at each branch we can have multiple internal nodes chained together. For example, here we have one and then the second level of an internal node, and then at the bottom we have the leaf nodes. And the decisions, so the questions or the options for the nodes connecting to the next node or the leaf nodes, is the so-called branch. It's just like the branch of the tree. And note that there are two types of nodes. So one type of node does a binary split. So in this case, this one is a binary one, and this one is a binary one. So binary just means there are only two options. In this case, it's the option yes or no. And there are also the multi-category ones. So here, in this case, we have one with three possible options. So that's more like a general categorical one. So binary is like a subcategory of categorical, but here in this case, we have a categorical one with three outputs. And recall from the last lecture, we can actually convert like a categorical split like this one here into a binary split or multiple binary splits, right? So in particular, we learned about the one-hot encoding. So we could technically convert this one into three binary variables, or we can also drop one of them and just convert it to two binary variables. For example, then we can have a node that is asking the question, is it sunny? And then we can have a yes and a no. And then if it's yes, we can say go to beach. And if the answer is no, we can ask the next question, is it overcast? So again, we have yes and no. If the answer is yes, we can say go running. And if it's no, basically, then we know it's already rainy, right? So we don't have to include a node for rainy here. So if it's no, we directly go to the next question. That would be friends busy. So now we are basically here. So in that way, we can convert a categorical split into multiple binary splits. And that is also what scikit-learn does in the decision tree implementation. It only builds binary splits because it's computationally easier than these multiple category splits. But we will talk about this in more detail of how these decision trees work and how they construct these splits. Here, this was mainly just an overview of how a decision tree might look like. So there may be binary splits and there could be these categorical splits, and different decision tree implementations handle that differently. But the key idea is also we can convert a decision tree with these categorical splits into decision trees with only binary splits. So intuitively, we can also think of decision trees as rule sets or sets of rules. By the way, there's a whole body of research behind this topic. It's called rule-based learning, or there's one branch called learning classifier systems, which is basically concerned with learning rules that can be combined into a classifier. However, you cannot convert every set of rules into a decision tree, but you can convert every decision tree into a set of rules. So let's take a look at a simple example of how we can convert certain decisions of the decision tree into rules. And with that, I mean like if-else rules, like in programming. So if we consider the rules for the prediction stay in, we can take a look at this branch here that I outlined in red. So if we would want to convert that into an if-else rule, we can say if work to do is no, and then the conjunction and the outlook is rainy and friends are busy. Then stay inside. By the way, I just see there's another stay in, so we can then also say, so if these conditions are true, or, so we can have a union, oops, let me do this properly, a union or work to do equals yes. So if either this condition is true, so here we have a conjunction, so this chain of conditions is true, or this condition is true, then we predict stay inside. So in that way we can convert the decision tree branches into sets of rules. Yeah, the fact that we can convert a decision tree into sets of rules makes decision trees also a very attractive model from a machine learning interpretation or explainability aspect. So there is a branch of machine learning concerned with interpretability. It's called interpretable machine learning, or some people also call it explainable machine learning. So sometimes it's highly desirable to have a machine learning model that is easy to understand and easy to read. For example, think of a case where you build a model for a bank and you have a customer applying for a credit card. Now, let's say the unfortunate case is true that the customer gets denied the credit card, so the machine learning model rejects the application, and then now the customer asks, why did that happen? So why was my credit card denied? So in that case, if the machine learning model is interpretable, like a decision tree, it's easy to understand. Someone could just, maybe take a look at the decision tree if it's not too deep, and then come up with some rules and basically then highlight to the customer, maybe this was rejected because, let's say, the application wasn't filled out properly, there was some information missing, or let's say the customer already had too many other credit cards and stuff like that. So based on the decision tree, you can track down the decision and explain to the customer the possible reason why the decision was made. So personally, I also worked with decision trees in some computational biology projects where I was collaborating with people in biology who were studying the sea lampreyfish in the Great Lakes. So the sea lampreyfish in the Great Lakes is an invasive species, and the way they wanted to prevent the sea lamprey population to grow even bigger in the Great Lakes was to inhibit the mating of the sea lamprey. So what happens is, let me sketch that here. If you have the big lake and there are like these little rivers attached to the Great Lake, what happens is in certain times of the year, around April and May, the male fish, they swim upstream and then they build nests or nesting sites, and then they release a pheromone back to the lake. So they will secrete a pheromone, and this pheromone is perceived by the female lamprey, and then they swim also to these nesting sites and then mate with a male sea lamprey and produce more lampreys. So to prevent that, the researchers try to find a molecule that is very similar to this pheromone molecule, but if it goes to the female, it blocks the receptor in the female that would smell the real pheromone. So we wanted to find some analog molecule that can inhibit the pheromone receptor. So here is how the pheromone molecule looks like, and there are certain chemical groups on that pheromone compound. It's, if I remember correctly, I think it's called 3-KPZS, which stands for 3-ketopetromycinol sulfate, if I remember this correctly. In any case, so we wanted to find a molecule that has similar properties, and then we wanted to test that in experiments whether it has the desired effect of inhibiting the pheromone receptor. So we had a lot of candidates that we tested, and then here are some of these overlaid with this real pheromone. So the cyans, the one in blue here, the transparent ones are the pheromone here, and then in green are our candidate molecules. And you can see there are some molecules that are very similar to the pheromone, so they overlay in certain chemical groups here, and here in percent is an activity of that molecule. So you can see this one is 90% inhibiting the receptor, so this is a good one. and this one is a good one too. However, you can see, for example, here, this one is not overlapping. It's a different type of atom here. Here it's overlapping, but certain groups of that molecule are different. Still, it's very active here in this case. However, now we have a candidate here that also overlaps here, but then there's zero activity. And other candidates, they overlap here, and here there's only 3.2% inhibition. So now, given the data set, we had millions of molecules, and we tested hundreds of molecules in experiments for these activity values. So what makes a molecule active? So what do the active ones have in common? So in that case, we trained a decision tree classifier to predict active versus non-active. So I turned this regression problem into a classification problem. What I did is I assigned the values as follows. So if we had a inhibition between 0%, which was the worst, basically 0 inhibition, up to 100 inhibition is what we wanted. So this was ideal. What I did is I defined everything up to 40% as non-active. Let me do that in red. So this was non-active. And everything larger than 60%, so 60 up to here, 60%, this was active. So this was then, let's say, active, class 1, and the other one, inactive or non-active, was class 0. And everything in between I didn't consider for this project because it was like ambiguous. It was like the boundary between active and non-active, so I only considered the more extreme cases between non-active smaller than 40% and active bigger than 60%. And then I built a decision tree here. And based on the decision tree, I could see what the active molecules have in common. So later on, when I show you the code example, we will revisit figures like that. It was created by scikit-learn, this figure. We will revisit how we can read that. So the way scikit-learn, the decision tree works, is it's doing the decision of a binary variable. If you have a 0 and a 1 as possible classes, it will formulate the question as smaller or equal to 0.5. So if we have something like smaller or equal to 0.5 for a feature, this means the same as the feature is not present. It's basically, you can think of it as 0. Whereas if we have something like greater than 0.5, this would then mean 1 or true if we have a binary feature. So in other words, the true here means 0, like absence of the feature, and this means 1, the presence of that feature. So in order to read that, it's a little bit intuitive, but it's like how the scikit-learn decision tree works, how it's implemented. So what that means is that here on the left-hand side, everything here does not have the sulfur. So no sulfur. And the sulfur group would be this one here, the atom. So most of the non-active ones don't have a sulfur, and most of the active ones, let me use blue here, the active ones have this sulfur atom overlapping with the pheromone. So we know already sulfur is important. So if we look at these, what values here means, it's meaning 2 molecules. So we will have 2 and 12, 14 molecules in this node, and then 2 molecules are, maybe I shouldn't circle it here because it's a little bit confusing. 2 molecules out of the 14 are non-active, class 0, and 12 are active, so that means class 1. Now then we would do the next split and check for the sulfur at A* group and so forth, and we can then untangle the decisions and can see what makes molecules active, or what do the active ones have in common. So what features do they have in common? So the active ones have a sulfur and a sulfur at A*. And I'm currently a little bit confused why this one doesn't show up here as active. I think actually this one was not a sulfur, it was a phosphate group. It's also this darker orange here compared to this yellow. Yellow, I think, is the sulfur. Darker orange was the phosphate. In any case, yeah, so it's a long time since I worked on this problem. So yeah, but what we can see here is that we can construct a decision tree to better understand the data, to kind of untangle what active and non-active molecules have in common. And then we could use that knowledge not only to make classifications or predictions on new molecules, but we can also ask a chemist to make certain modifications to molecules to make them likely more active, to add some necessary condition to the molecule. For example, changing this phosphate to a sulfur or sulfate to make the molecule maybe active. Yeah, as a brief follow-up, I paused the video and did some online research just to double check what was going on with the previous molecule. It was indeed a phosphate, not a sulfur for that, for this case here. So this was indeed a phosphate, which is why it's not showing up here. I was for a second confused, and now this clarifies. But if this was all very confusing, you don't have to know the details about all the biology here. It was just like an hopefully interesting example of how decision trees are useful because they are interpretable. And we will also take a look at how to read these types of figures later on in a later video when we implement the decision trees in scikit-learn. Because right now there are many things that are confusing, for example, what the guinea here means and so forth. So, but just to briefly go over it again. So, this equals a smaller equal 0.5 is just one way of how scikit-learn deals with binary variables. So if we have a variable, let's say sulfur, that can be either 0 or 1. 0.5 is basically in the center. It's just the type of algorithm, how it works. It says if smaller than equal to 0.5, which is in the center here, right? 0.5. So then it would predict 0 if this is true. And if it's false, it will predict 1. Consequently, this means false for 0.5 means feature value 1. And true then means feature value 0. And this class here, this is just using or highlighting the majority class in this given node. So in each node you have a given subset of the training examples. Here you have you start with 38 molecules, and 23 of these molecules have class 1. So this is class 0, index 0, and this is index 1 in this array, and this would then also correspond to class 0 and class 1. Or in short, 23 of the 38 molecules are class 0, and 15 molecules out of the 38 molecules are class 1. And 1 in our case was active, and the other one was non-active. And then you can see the number of samples always goes down because we split a subset of the training examples further into further subsets. But again, this will become more clear when we look at a simpler example like the iris flower dataset. And lastly, the last line here, the class, it's just showing the majority class. So if the majority class is non-active here, the first one, then it will show non-active. If it's the majority class that is active, for example, here on the, we use a different color here on the right-hand side, if most of them are active, 8 out of the 8, then it will show active here. So that's all what class means. You can define the class names yourself. So non-active and active is what I defined myself, but by default it will basically be based on the index position here. And again, we will take a look at more code examples at the end of this lecture. Here, this was just more like an intuitive example of how we can apply a decision tree on a practical problem. Now, lastly, one more aspect about decision trees and why decision trees are cool is that we can combine decision trees into so-called random forests or adaptive or gradient boosting algorithms, and these are ensemble methods. And ensemble methods are something we are going to cover in the next lecture, in lecture 7. So decision trees kind of form the foundation of random forests, adaptive boosting and gradient boosting, and we will take a look at that in the next lecture. But now let's take a look at recursive algorithms and the runtime complexity of decision trees.